go. Well, hello, welcome to this panel on the story of digital theology. I will have to maybe make a reminder, please do mute yourself. And if you're in the room, big room, room 200 in Zurich, please make sure that you're muted and your speakers are off. So digital theology is still a field that is developing and evolving. But to understand where we are today, we need to think a little bit about where we've come from. And I think we can recognize that, I guess digital theology as a field, hasn't got is not strongly defined, but also that we have come to the field through different starting points, whether they are people that we've read, whether they are discipline or our cultural or ecclesial belongings. And it's some of this that we're trying to tease out in this session together in this panel. And with me, I have the pleasure of being joined by Heidi Campbell, who's professor of communication at Texas A&M. And we also have Pete Phillips, who's now a lecturer in digital theology, mission and practice at Cliff College in the UK. And we also have Alex Chow, who's senior lecturer in world Christianity at the University of Edinburgh. Now, they have in their own ways made a significant contribution to the field, and we are going to hear their version of the history of digital theology. And particularly, I've asked them to make this story autobiographical. So reflecting on, why they have become the digital theologians that they are today. So I'm going to ask Heidi to go first. So you've got about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll hear from Pete and Alex.
All right. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to speak to this and talk about my own journey into digital theology. So this journey for me began back in the mid-1990s when I started my master's and then PhD work at the University of Edinburgh. And, from my perspective, science and religion as kind of this area of discourse really started to kind of form in the 1990s as far as becoming recognized. I think it was about that time in the 1990s that the AAR made it one of the section areas within the academy, and people began to talk about science, religion, and technology. Often got added into that conversation, but really the focus was mostly on bioethics and biotechnologies that were emerging at that time. And there was very little discourse really about kind of technology, especially related to computers and computer science, and looking at kind of information technologies. So my work first was introduced to kind of two areas of conversation. We had people in the philosophy of technology that were coming from religious perspectives that often were adding ideas about theological reflection into their writings. People like Carl Mitchum, Paulo Freire. And then we had conversation areas kind of loosely in kind of theology, but theology of media. So people like Jacques Ellul were kind of well known in that time period. And Marshall McLuhan, though he was a media scholar, he had a very public conversion to Catholicism. And so he's often included into that group. And so from my perspective, it was really kind of the advent of the internet that began to get people to look at kind of, this area of theology and the internet, theology and computers in a different way. Now, my own research work, I was studying kind of online communities in the mid-1990s. And my theological reflection started out with work of Pierre Desjardins, looking at his ideas of the new sphere and in some of the ideas that Ilion Deo from Villanova works with. I was actually, when I went to my PhD supervisor then and said, hey, this is where I want to work with, they kind of advised me that in a Reformed theological context, basing my theology on a Catholic theologian that was branded a heretic may not be the best move in my career. So after my PhD proposal, I kind of refigured my kind of work and based it a lot on the work of Avery Dulles and his models of the church, and kind of looked at Miroslav Volf's theology of Trinity. And those were some of the conversation partners I brought in. But I think, a lot of the work in digital theology that really inspired me in those early days came out a lot of the British kind of context. And so I just want to kind of mention a few of the early readings that I read during my PhD days that really kind of informed my thinking. The work of Gordon Graham. He wrote a book based on his own PhD theology on virtual morality, and he was trying to bring computer science in conversation with Christian ethics. And at Heriot Watt University in the UK, and really was kind of the first person trying to kind of see how could we kind of think about what are the ethical frameworks and limitations of kind of a computer age, and how that might affect our understanding of Christian ethics. Douglas Groothuis, he actually was based in the US, but was having a lot of conversations with scholars in the UK. He wrote a book that came out in 1999, The Soul of Cyberspace. But before that, he wrote a number of articles in British journals about looking at Christian scholarship and cyberspace technologies. And there was also the early work of kind of David Chow. He was looking at and bringing in conversations from Ellul and McLuhan into looking at how that might shape our understanding of the church and its intersection with the internet and its use of the internet, as well as Eric Stoddart's work. He finished his PhD similar to the time I did in the early 2000s, and he was working in the area of Christian ethics and digital surveillance and internet technologies. And finally, coming actually from the German context, Anna First, she was one of the first people really to kind of get into the area of digital technology, digital theology, but really looking at from an AI question. So she was writing about doing postdoc work at MIT in the US, looking at the questions of, Imago Dei and robots, and how do we kind of understand, could, robots be, kind of not just sentient at some point, but also kind of be seen within this realm of Imago Dei. So, I could talk for hours about kind of my influences, but I think, as far as like for me, coming out of my PhD work and kind of where I saw my work kind of starting to contribute to this emerging area of digital technology, I think one of the things that I've contributed is that I think a lot of the early discourse about technology, digital technology, was either this continuum that often emerges: technology bad, technology good. Going to destroy Christian communities, going to embrace or enrich Christian communities. Being influenced by the social shaping of technology and social science. Emphasis coming out of the University of Edinburgh, I really grasped onto the social shaping of technology. And I studied under Robin Williams at the STS Center there in Edinburgh. And that really kind of shaped me, saying that, hey, there needs to be some kind of middle ground in the evaluation of technology that would also enrich and maybe give more critical reflection to how we see the church, Christian communities being impacted by technology. So that's one contribution. I think a second contribution my work has made is just kind of the idea that, we can look at that there may be tools from the area of sociology of technology, sociology of community, that may give us new frameworks for talking about Christian community, Christian identity, Christian authority. And I think, I've always said that, theology is great at capturing where, kind of the eschaton, where we want to go and where we are going in terms of spiritual development as, the global church. But it often hasn't done a good job of kind of capturing the moment that we live in. And so, for me, I think some of my work on community and looking at communities as networks of social relationships, bringing those ideas from sociology into conversations with theology, have kind of helped kind of give a more kind of realistic or balanced reflection on how do we deal with the ethos that we have, and how technology is shaping our world, and how can theology speak into those kind of spaces. And the last thing I think I would say is that, I've tried to be kind of very practical in my work. So kind of not just looking at how the different technologies that emerge from, the World Wide Web to social networks, to social media, I have shaped kind of conversations about religion and theology, but also kind of saying what are the values of technology and how do they coalesce or compete with the values of different religious communities, especially the Christian tradition. And so that's been big for me, and not just like focusing on the technology itself, but kind of how do we kind of create a long-term conversation about technology and the AI emerging sphere. So that's what I would have to say about my contribution and my uh, journey with digital theology.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very rich. Lots to explore there, Heidi. Pete, I'm gonna give you the word next. You need to unmute.
I need to unmute. That's a theological question, really, isn't it? A statement. I think a different kind of story for how digital theology happened around Durham in about 2013 onwards. Part of which time Heidi came and stayed in Durham, writing one of the books, weren't you? And you stayed with Bex or at Bex's house. And so it's been a kind of a time where we've kind of explored what's going on about digital and how does that impact the theological. So I'm a Methodist minister, a half-time Methodist minister, half-time academic, and that kind of means that perhaps the theological has it's got traction because I've got to put it into practice in my church work as well as into my academic work as well. And so when I went to Durham to work with David Wilkinson on Codec, which was the Centre for Digital Theology, or that's what it became. We were really looking at this whole kind of thing about how do we engage with digital culture in a way that actually makes Christianity still relevant? How do we make that useful? How do we push that? And one of our big projects we started off with was the Big Bible Project, which was kind of looking at bigger conversations around the Bible. What does the Bible mean? And my PhD is in John's Gospel. That I started off as a biblical studies person and kind of have drifted into theology and so on. And so biblical literacy became really important. What are we doing about what's happening with the Bible? And I've had that strand of keeping up with the Bible and digital literacy. And my book, The Bible, Social Media and Digital Culture, tries to do that a bit. But I was working with a great team. Andy Byers, at the very beginning of our time at Codec, produced Theomedia, and his book was exploring how God is a God of media. God is a God who promulgates media and therefore is part and parcel of that. And therefore, as we are media consumers and media creators ourselves, we too stand in that image. And that began the kind of twist around, Imago Dei and so on. How about the fact that we are indeed in the pattern of the Creator? And if indeed God is a creator and perhaps a technologist, does that make us also part of that kind of stream? Is technology part of the Imago Dei? I'm not sure. I think God's a technologist. I'm not too sure whether. It opens up so many questions, see, on theology about whether animals are therefore in the Imago Dei because animals have technology in some places, and so or in some instances. So you kind of see how the theological questions bubble up, and one of the reasons they bubbled up was because we had great people working with us at Durham. Bex Lewis, Tim Hutchings for a while, Karen O'Donnell, who's now in Cambridge, Marika Rose, Winchester, and other places, Josh Mann, David Ford, all these people strongly theological because that's what we're trying to appoint, and then Jonas, of course, as well. But trying to appoint theologians in order to try and push us deeper and deeper into what a theological understanding might be. Tim, of course, wrote his PhD on creating churches online at Durham, and worked with Codec as well for a while. My feeling was that we were actually kind of seeing a kind of bifurcation from, oh no, Tim, don't say that, a bifurcation between digital religion on the one hand which Bex and others were very keen on because it looked at the sociological impact of digitality and Christianity, or digitality and religion. But then this whole kind of thing of, is there something different about digital theology? Is there something else that we need to look at in terms of how it impacts how we think about God, how we think about the divine, and so on. And so we've begun to kind of push down that line while at the same time keeping the biblical in mind all the time. So Josh and David and so on wrote a book on the Bible and millennials. We continue that kind of process of exploring what the Bible is trying to do, or what a society is doing with the Bible. Indeed, I'm now rewriting Bible, digital media and digital theology and social media, because I think I want to go back to the digital habitus, or the algorithmic habitus. I dodged the question in the book and suggested I'm not too sure whether it is indeed about the development of MTD, moralistic therapeutic deism, which I kind of pinned it on. But I think actually it may well have been an early sign of the algorithmic habitus, all that way back. And that therefore I want to kind of go back and look at that and see how much the algorithmic habitus, that's Araldi and Romelli, of course, are developing that. And so all the way through, what I tried to do when Jonas and Kyle and myself wrote the article that appeared in De Groot and so on, was to suggest that digital theology needed to shift to that theological register. It needed to take the great doctrines of the faith and begin to say what's happening. It's interesting then that it almost, 2019, 2020, we shot into the COVID lockdown. We lost our place at Durham. We were sent into our time elsewhere, in the wilderness, as it were, for a little while. And then lots of the questions came up about communion in the church. What's happening about that? About how we worship online, about is online worship actually accepted or not? And those very questions are still going on. So there is this whole kind of model about, well, where have we got with digital theology? Are we at a place where actually people are still looking at these, or is it pushing us away into a different place? I'm intrigued by Magnifica Humanitas, and I wrote a small piece that's on Substack at the moment about that, and want to kind of look back at it again in another big chapter I'm writing. But the whole question about whether a theological appraisal of AI is justified, well, is met by chapter 99 of Magnifica Humanitas. Or do we need to go further with AI? Do we need to look further at AI? No, AI doesn't think. AI doesn't have a body yet. But you might, if you try to define humanity by a cell in the mother's womb, then you wouldn't say that is humanity full-fledged. And so what is the development of that? What's the theology of AI? And I think the church hasn't quite got there yet. I was well aware at the same time that digital religion has always been Heidi's thing. It's a fantastic, well, and all the people you work with, Heidi, as well. It's a massive field which we've drawn on absolutely fantastically, and in a way it's kind of like a symbiosis between the two things now, because a lot of digital religion stuff, for example, the social shaping of technology and so on, comes into digital theology. And I can see a lot of digital theology coming into the digital religion world. So it's not as though it's an either or, it's a both and, a twin way of approaching how we engage with the digital. And I think that strengthens our understanding of the digital and has continued to do so. One of the great things as well is that means that we're an even larger network, and we're a global network, and that we transcend British theology, as it were, or white Western male theology. And that's absolutely fantastic, that we actually can kind of say that we want to push that further and further to ensure that we do actually have a global network, which seeks to be global in terms of both geographical coverage, but also in terms of diversity in EDI and so on. So that's my overview, a brief account of how I think digital theology has gone. A lot of those people have moved on to other places and are feeding into their own exploration of what theology is about. And that's fantastic, because digital theology isn't an end isn't its own end. It's up to us to kind of take it beyond and where we want to go. I'll shut up. Back into silence.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Pete. Alex, over to you.
Hi there. Thanks for the time, and it's a pleasure, a privilege, and daunting for me to be on this panel, especially with my esteemed colleagues on this call, especially Heidi and Pete and Jonas. All of whom I've learned a lot about digital theology, digital religion, digital theology, and everything in between. And in many ways, I'm indebted to them. I am in many ways a latecomer to the subject of digital theology versus the other three that are spotlighted on this call. I should say that my own background, my first degree was in computer science, and I spent about a decade as a software engineer before shifting to theology. Then did 3 degrees in theology, as you do, and my PhD was at the University of Birmingham when I was finishing my PhD at the University of Birmingham on mainland Chinese theology. That was my area of interest. My supervisor sends me this email and he says, "Hey, there's this thing called codec happening in Durham. Why don't you check this out?" I was like, "Okay, what is that?" And it was there that I first met Pete and Heidi and learned of what was happening there in Durham. But as my PhD supervisor advised, and every PhD supervisor is always very wise, right? My supervisor advised, focus on your Chinese theology for your first bits, and then later on do some digital stuff if you want, because you have to have like a specialization, right? So my first 2 books were on mainland Chinese theology, looking at questions of soteriology and ecclesiology and public theology in the mainland Chinese space. And I fast forward to my time in Edinburgh, at the University of Edinburgh, doing work on world Christianity. And then I get an email from somebody else from Durham, Jonas Kurlberg, who says, "Hey, you want to do some stuff on digital theology?" I was like, okay, know nothing about that. I should read into that. And so clearly I am connected to all these people. But as I've been kind of, especially through Jonas's encouragements, I've been brought into the discussion in different ways. My background in many ways shapes a lot of my approach to digital theology. On the one hand, because my academic interest has been primarily theological. I tend to think in very classical terms of classical doctrines and theological ethics and these types of questions, which is why in the Oxford Handbook of Digital Theology, I wrote the chapter on creation, for instance. So classic Christian theological topic. But I also wrote that chapter because I was a software engineer once upon a time. And actually, when I was reflecting as an engineer theologically about my trade as an engineer, creation was one of these themes that was quite important as an engineer, to create, the ability to create, and how does that then relate to classical thinking in terms of creation. But also the other aspect, which I do a lot of work in, is broadly speaking, is described as world Christianity, often Christianity in the non-Western world. That's a very simplistic definition, but basically trying to ask questions of how Christianity from different global, cultural, epistemological starting points offer different ways of thinking theologically or thinking about Christianity or the practice of Christianity. And so one of the additional aspects that I tend to bring, and I definitely brought when as part of the editorial process for the Oxford Handbook on Digital Theology, is a global kind of a vantage point. I was trying to be attentive to authors that came from different starting points, but also that the scholarship that people were citing, were mindful of a wider scope than simply a Western or a Euro-American starting point. And I think for me, I think that has been an important one for me to think through, because I think when in the work of world Christianity, broadly speaking, oftentimes it's well, let's include this X region or X context because we haven't covered that, right? And doing so is kind of not very helpful, to be honest. Yes, it's helpful to think about new contexts, but actually it's more helpful to reflect on that and how those contexts reshape and rethink different categories. And different ways of engaging with digital theology or any other aspect of Christianity or Christian studies. And so for my perspective, that's the area that I would like to see more in the conversation. I think the Oxford Handbook in particular has tried to push into that realm, but I don't. If I'm fully honest, I don't think it's done a good enough job in that area, and I blame the editors for that. But it's an area that I think is really important, because not only is it that digital technologies are used by people around the globe in different ways and so forth, but also the impact is different for different communities around the globe. I mean, we talk about AI and we talk about the digital technologies, the materiality of the technologies that are being produced, and we have to reckon with the environmental, the material costs, the inequalities that are throughout the globe that are magnified by the use of AI technologies and the like, environmentally and human ethical considerations, and so it's thinking about those implications in the midst of theological reflection on the digital that I in particular am interested in. So thank you very much for your time, and turn it back to Jonas.
Okay, thank you very much. I think part of what we've been trying to do in this panel is to show that there are different ways of coming into digital theology, and I'm assuming there will be lots of different ways of answering this question amongst people who are joining us here today. I want just to give a little bit of opportunity to Heidi, Pete, and Alex to respond to what they've heard from one another, and maybe just probe a little bit more around that. So I don't know if anyone wants to start the conversation, and then after that, I'll probably give a bit of time for more open questions from everyone else.
I think I want to pick up on a point that Pete he said a couple things in his talk about the American Academy of Religion, as well as I think in one of the comments you just posted in the chat forum. I found kind of digital theology as an area while it kind of has connections to the science, technology, and religion discourse at the AAR and in theology more broadly, there has been this sense of kind of tension I have felt, at least from the early days, about the digital theology. Oh, you don't quite fit into science and religion studies, which has really a very strong identity, a whole set of different journals and kind of avenues and whatnot. And sometimes, especially, digital theology work does get, like published in things like Zygon. But yet at the same time, I kind of always felt the sense of maybe that they treat us as the stepchild, as it were. And so I would love to kind of hear, from that kind of sense of like, how digital theology is framed maybe in the broader academy. And, is there anything that we can do or things that maybe do to kind of either show our uniqueness or show the contribution we're making that maybe is not always recognized? So thoughts, even from Jonas.
Oh, sorry, I clicked. Peter, do you want to come in? No, I've been more recently. I've been looking more at kind of theologies of technology, that does come more out of a science and religion perspective. Um, and I don't necessarily think that there doesn't have to be a strong divide as far as I see it with digital theology. I think it's one way of approaching digital theology. Um, yeah, but I think digital theology, most of what I've seen published under the label digital theology, has probably been more inspired by the social shaping of technology, sociology, and religion and science seems to be more on the philosophy of religion side of things. So that might be, but I don't necessarily think that there has to be a divide between the two. Um, and 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 digital theology has been more interested in question of Christian practice. I think it's to generalize.
I think can I come in? I think one of the things I've got an article published in Zygon, which is great, but that's because I was invited to go to a science and technology conversation at Birmingham. Now that's also part of the whole thing about so we lost our place at Durham, just as we were supposed to be going to mainstream there because of COVID, and COVID, the MA was kind of in transit. But I think there's also kind of that means that to some extent, digital theology has always remained as a kind of as an interesting space itself, because the academics who are running it don't have, or not running it, but pioneering it, didn't have and don't have formal status within the academy, and that's quite interesting to see that happening. That yes, suddenly Tim, in Nottingham and others are developing, and Alex, at Edinburgh and so on, and lots of people in Germany, and Switzerland and so on, and in America, and so we're beginning to see it happen. And hopefully that will just throw and throw. And of course, at Lund with Frida and the team that she's developed has there. So more and more people are being engaged, and of course, Stephen down in New Zealand, sorry. But it may be that actually digital theology still hasn't become fully embedded within the academic world. Perhaps because it's always going to be that kind of peripheral thing that connects with so many different things. One time we're talking about the theology of communion, the next minute we're talking about Blade Runner, the next minute we're talking about biblical literacy. And so perhaps we're too diffuse, rather than having a department which kind of clearly focuses upon this one aspect, theological anthropology or something, which may have been more useful for our critique of Magnificat Humanitas. But we're zippy all over the place, rather than focused and keeping on the tram lines, I suppose. I don't know what people think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a question of whether that's important or not. But it's also interesting, Pete, to note that there are now a number of academics, theologians who have digital theology in their job title, including Scott, who's joined us, Scott Midson, who's here, and Florian and Sabrina Miller as well. So, I mean, in some ways. I feel a bit of an ambiguity about whether I think this is it important that there is that that digital theology exists as a field that's recognized, or do I, yeah, or which I think that does what it does, I suppose, is that they encourage people to it puts it a little bit on the map, the questions that are raised within the field a bit more on the map.
Yeah. I,
Yeah.
I just yeah, I just asked the question, maybe it's kind of a sideline, just because not because we have to have that, that kind of certain status, but I think we live in this academic world that where like grants go towards certain things, and like I was recently in a science and religion event at Texas A&M, which is a very engineering science based school, and the colleagues there and I was speaking from digital theology, how we see this this kind of intersection, and they said, well, you don't really do science and religion studies. And I'm like they completely said, well, what I didn't even fit in to what they did. Of course, again, they were engineers and talking about computer science from a very engineering perspective, but I kind of felt that was very an interesting kind of position. And I think, it's sometimes in the academy, we're forced to kind of, and I'm more of a big table kind of person versus a small box kind of person, but, we fight those battles oftentimes in these contexts. So.
I mean, I wonder if I could just give a slightly different perspective coming from my area in world Christianity, because world Christianity is one of these things that Edinburgh has a very long history in world Christianity, and it's taken nearly 3 decades for that field to be recognized as a field and more chairs around the world with the title World Christianity. But I think constantly what I'm trying to battle is not having exclusive chairs and stuff with world Christianity, but actually making that mainstream within theological and Christian studies. And so I think in some ways that's also what it is with digital theology, that there is much that can benefit from having a separate community and discourse around that, but also encouraging that discourse to be folded into the more mainstream discourse as well. So I think it needs both in many ways.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna open up for anyone else. There's lots of good comments in the chat. So if you want to make a comment or raise a question, ask a question, please do raise your virtual hand so I can see you. Okay, Frida.
Hi, well, thank you. This was so interesting to listen to. I was thinking your conversation sparked a really interesting discussion in the chat about digital theology as a sort of a space instead of a field. And I was wondering, and perhaps this question is especially for you, Alex, but I'd love to hear the rest of you weigh in on this. What happens with a creative space when you publish an Oxford Handbook of Digital Theology?
Well, hopefully you put a door stopper out there. Uh, Literally, it's massive, and it gives. I think when Jonas and I were and Pete, we were talking about this very early on. The question is. Part of the question was, is it too early to have an Oxford Handbook in digital theology? and it took many years in making, and now half of it is out of date. No, just kidding, it's not. Go out and buy it. But I think that what it does is it does. I think our attempt was to start the conversation or make it a much more strong statement that it is a conversation point, and to open up the possibility for critique and pushback, and for that conversation to continue to morph. That would be my take on it. I don't know if others would like to respond.
So can I just go? I think the most important thing about digital theology is it's a conversation, and that's right. I think that's what Ghana was saying, that oh, sorry, it was Heidi. It said, sorry, Heidi. But the whole thing about it being a conversation, we are the conversation, we are digital theology. That's the point that we have this global network conference, rather than saying everyone's got to come over to thingy. That's why we try and do the kind of merged thing of being both in a space and in a or in a place and a space, as it were, because actually digital theology cannot be one person's thing. It cannot be this defined thing that this person is following through, because digitality is so huge and theology is so huge, and so that means that a handbook for digital theology can give us some of the markers in the conversation, some of the things that we've already talked about, but hopefully they'll burst open into a whole new range of things to talk about. And it'd be really interesting whether AI can pick up on that. And, whether AI will have the wisdom or the enough of the right words will come up for it to actually talk about theology at some time or other. Because without us, without human beings, I think that, we are digital theology. It's not a thing. It's not an academic subject or anything like that. It's the conversation.
Yeah, I like Alex's metaphor of putting a door stopper in, as far as like not to exclude people out, but to welcome people in, because I think this network has been good about kind of creating a kind of identity of people who are shared concerns over a broad topics, but kind of maybe at least concerns over certain areas, and certain kind of bringing certain kind of practices and theological methods into this kind of work. But we're not the only space in the world that are that is having these conversations. There's I know in the American context there's an evangelical kind of loose network of people that are doing it, and they do digital theology in a very different way with a very different set of different concerns. There's also a very strong Catholic network, that around the Vatican, and like where Magnificat Humanitas, that was actually 3 years in the making. Most of it was not written by Pope Leo, and was by Pope Francis and the people that he was working with. And so, like Catherine Schmidt, I think, who's on this call, she would recognize that there's a lot of voices, that are in that area that we need to do a better job of building bridges with. And there's a huge group of people in Southeast Asia, especially Catholics and evangelicals in the Philippines, that are doing this kind of work. And I'm hoping that the handbook kind of gives a place for us, not just for them to come in, but for us to help invite them in, so we can enrich our own conversation.
Thank you, Eddie. I wondered if there's someone who would like to come in at this point and actually tell a different kind of story of digital theology than what we've heard. I'm going to give you the opportunity to think about that, but we're going to hear from Amin first, if you want to ask your question.
Yes. So my question is regarding the format of the handbook, because I was a little bit shocked when you said it was maybe too early for a digital handbook, and I thought, no, it's way too late. And so since I think theology is not like for its own sake there, and the handbook should actually have a purpose for our current state and work. So I was thinking if there wasn't like considerations of a more agile format of the handbook? Is a book actually the right format, or should it rather be something that could be updated more regularly?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the conversation that we are having because we are a frustration. I think what many of us feel is that we recognize that the research we do is quite topical and current, and academic publication and publishing is slow for many reasons, and some of them are just institutional. But there are some attempts to do I think what you're alluding to, and I will lift here our friends who are running Cursor, which try to be a more of a faster way of publishing, but also allowing for a more interactive form of publishing. And if you want to have a look at that, that's a good example of maybe a different way of holding conversation. But yeah, I suppose a handbook and publications like that are just one way of disseminating research. And I mean, a conference like this is a different way where you do get people's latest research as well. So I'm not sure what the solution is. And then a lot of us are also engaged in academic and cultures and institutions where it's expected to publish in this particular way. So yeah. Okay, does anyone want to give a different kind of version? What's an untold story of digital theology? Give you an opportunity to do so.
Okay, thank you very much for the discussion. My name's Stephen Brown. I come from Geneva. I've been involved in the World Council of Churches and the World Association for Christian Communication. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the handbook tomorrow when it's launched, because I'm really interested to know more about what the contents is. I guess in a way, my path to digital theology has been a slightly different one, which starts from more from the issue of, in a sense, ecumenical ethics and what ecumenical ethics has to say about the digital challenges that we face today. So, 5 years ago, I guess, we had the consultation in Berlin on digital justice that involved different organizations, and some of the people who are involved here. There's another consultation last month before last around AI. And so in a sense where it's theology and theological ethics which are interrogating the technological developments that are taking place at the moment, and obviously the latest encyclical the latest encyclical, which has a focus on artificial intelligence, is a very interesting case study in all kinds of ways. So I don't know whether my way into digital theology is a slightly different way, but it's one area that I've been involved in for quite some time. And in the sense, as I said, it's not so much about the digital technologies that we're using in theology, but about how theology can itself become an interrogator of digital developments in the world, just as theology and ecumenical theology questions other developments in society as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I think that would resonate with quite a few of us. Theology as an interrogator. I think that's a good phrase as well. And I can see a number of people on the screen who I would think of associate with such an approach as well. So thank you for that. Yeah. Okay. Any final questions or even comments from the panel? Okay.
I do hope that we'll see more coming out from digital theologians on AI. There has been something already, but we need more, because I think that we can't leave Magnifica Humanitas as being the last word that the church has to say upon that subject. And it's important to kind of see where it's going to go and how it's going to go, and have Anthropic captured a rules-based system by sending out Fable and Mythos, and they've kind of forced America to put the restrictions on it and so on. They've created the means to be put into that mode, but there's not a big conversation yet, I don't think, about AI. Beth's written a fantastic book and everything about that, and sorry, I've forgotten, my names have gone again. There have been others who've written on it importantly as well, but we could have more.
Yeah, I think, again, I think that this is an important moment for digital theology, and for this group of kind of, again, expanding our conversation, not just into the, new realm of AI, but also into just, more diverse kind of conversation partners. And I think, we, a lot of attention has been given to Anthropic and, as bringing in Christian theologians, but, Anthropic also brought in a group of Muslim scholars and group of Buddhist scholars, and they just didn't get the media attention. And so there's interesting conversations happening with a lot of religious traditions. In fact, probably, the Catholics and the Buddhists are way more advanced than this group is in kind of trying to bringing together some unified kind of statements and stuff about AI and religious contributions to kind of not just the evaluation of, but the values that can kind of inform these technologies. And so I think, hopefully this challenges us to kind of be more kind of forward outreaching and networking with other groups to kind of enliven our conversations and also create, broader kind of work, spotlights for what we do.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the conversation. I think we'll actually end there, so we have a few minutes to breathe.